Good evening and welcome to our Bible study tonight. Let's pray before we start. Father, I just thank you for this chance to be together. And Lord, I just ask that you would lead us as we continue in our study of those who hold to a different faith. Lord, I just pray that you would help equip us to be better able to witness and share with those of different faiths, Lord, and help us to be bold in sharing our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Tonight we're going to move on in our discussion of Eastern religions, and we're going to transition from talking about Hinduism, which of course is the most ancient of Eastern faiths, and really I would argue that Hinduism is kind of the foundation of all Eastern faith, that all Eastern religions outside of the various folk religions are branched out of Hinduism. But tonight we're going to talk about what many consider to be Hinduism's most significant branch, and that is Buddhism. Buddhism is practiced in many, many different countries across the Near East and the Far East. It was by far the most dominant religion in Japan and in China for centuries. And then, of course, the Boxer Rebellion and the following communist revolution in China displaced Buddhism as the primary religion when it outlawed essentially all religious faith. Of course, Buddhism continues to be practiced in the Far East, in Japan, and in other countries, but also many people don't think of it in this way, but Buddhism is widely practiced in what we call the Near East, in particular in India, where it represents a significant number of the population are Buddhist. However, Buddhism represents more of a challenge for us when we're trying to understand it and trying to kind of wrap our arms around what it is and what it believes, because the followers of Buddhism do not necessarily acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. And I know that that's a shocker because it's one of the world's largest religions. And yet followers of Buddhism do not specifically acknowledge the existence of supreme being. You can be a believer in God or in some form of deity, or you can be a non-believer or an agnostic, I guess you would say, as far as such things are concerned, and still be a practicing Buddhist, because Buddhism is not so much about an encounter with God as it is about experiencing a state of personal enlightenment, what they consider to be a state of inner peace and wisdom. Now, here is where Buddhism kind of traces back to its grandfather in Hinduism, right? Because remember, when we talked about Hinduism, we talked about the path, and the path being the path to ultimate spiritual liberation. But here, the same kind of concept, except that the idea is achieving enlightenment, and it's not so much achieving enlightenment in quite the same way, because we talked about the fact that the ultimate goal of the Hindu path is being released from the constant cycle of death and rebirth. So you achieve moksha, and you've achieved spiritual liberation, and you don't get recycled over and over again, coming back as a different person. In Buddhism, the goal is that to reach that state of inner peace in this life. When followers of Buddhism reach this so-called echelon of peace, they refer to it as nirvana. Now, most of us in Western culture know the word nirvana because a rock band chose that as its name, but they borrowed the concept or the idea directly from Buddhism. Their religion's founder, Gautama, is considered to be an extraordinary man, but he is not a god. And in fact, the Buddha is simply a title for him and is not his actual name. We'll talk just a little bit here in a moment about the history of it. But the word Buddha simply means enlightened or an enlightened one. The path to enlightenment, of course, is attained by being a moral person, by meditating, by achieving higher wisdom. In fact, Buddhists will often meditate because they believe it helps awaken truth. There is this concept in Buddhism that if you meditate long enough and you become and you excel at it, you become good enough at it, that you will open up a path into spiritual wisdom, and you'll frequently hear people who have a Buddhist background refer to opening up the third eye, okay? Now, what that means is the eye of spiritual enlightenment. You have two eyes with which you see the physical world, but there is a third eye, which is the eye of spiritual enlightenment. There are a great many philosophies and interpretations within Buddhism which make it almost impossible to define what Buddhism is. It is, of course, a tolerant religion, but it is also a constantly evolving and changing religion, and because of that, trying to pin down Buddhist beliefs is like trying to pin Jell-O to the wall. It's really, really difficult to really understand it in the same way that we look for dogma and belief system and that kind of thing, but Buddhism really kind of seems to shun that altogether. In fact, many scholars who have studied Buddhism for years don't even recognize Buddhism as a religion, but instead refer to it as a spiritual tradition. Buddhism is, at its foundation, a belief system that encourages people to avoid self-indulgence while at the same time avoiding self-denial. This is, many people believe that this comes from the fact that Gautama grew up in a Hindu family, a wealthy family, but a Hindu family, and grew up with the traditions of Vedic Hinduism as part of his life, and came in the early stages to reject the concept of the caste system and to reject the idea of complete and total self-denial. He comes along as a reformer, and this is why Buddha is always depicted in paintings as being happy, smiling, fat little dude, right? Because his whole attitude toward spiritual development and spiritual growth was that it did not require self-denial on the kind of level that we talked about a little bit when we talked about Hinduism for the past couple of weeks. Remember, I talked about the idea that if you were truly devoted, a true devotee of Vedic Hinduism, you could literally fast to the point of starvation, right? Whereas Buddha rejected that concept and that idea and said, the path of self-denial is no better than the path of self-indulgence, right? So he taught what he saw as the third path, the path that was between the two extremes of self-denial and self-indulgence. His most important teachings are referred to as the Four Noble Truths, and those are essential to understanding the Buddhist practice, the Buddhist way of life. So I want to talk to you here for just a moment, if I can get the pages to separate. That Buddhists, like Hindus, embrace the concept of karma, the law of cause and effect, and they also do believe in the continuous cycle of rebirth or reincarnation, but they don't view it in the same way that a Hindu does, in the sense that they necessarily see reincarnation as a punishment, okay? The idea behind the foundational idea of Vedic Hinduism is that reincarnation happens because we've been bad. So we have to just keep doing it over and doing it over and doing it over till we get it right. When we finally do it right, we'll get moksha. We'll obtain escape. Whereas the Buddhist doesn't necessarily view it that way. For them, the continuous cycle of death and rebirth is just part of the universe. It's part of the way things are. Followers of Buddhism may worship in temples, or they may worship in their own homes. There's no sense in which they feel an obligation to attend a temple or a particular holy place. The monks of Buddhism, called bhikkhus, follow a strict code of conduct which includes a life of celibacy. So they do not marry, they do not engage in sexual activity. There is no single Buddhist symbol, but there are a number of images which have evolved over time that represent Buddhist beliefs. So you'll often see those things being included in Buddhist symbology. These include the lotus flower. I'm sure you've probably seen pictures or representations of the lotus flower. The eight-spoked wheel, which is a symbol of Dharma. The Bodhi tree, which is another symbol which represents the place where Buddha received his enlightenment. And then, most interestingly of all, is the swastika. Now, many people are shocked when they discover that the swastika is a part of Buddhist imagery. I did not include it up here because I thought it would be too distracting and might draw some unwanted attention if people saw that we had a swastika flying up on our screen here at church. But the swastika is a part of Buddhist imagery. People are shocked when they find that out, but they're equally shocked when they discover that Hitler actually got it from Buddhism and from ancient Hinduism. Okay, so this is a symbol that stretches all the way back many, many, many centuries, and it's simply, the symbol simply was a symbol of well-being. Okay, Hitler adopted it because he adopted many, many, many ideas from many different faiths. In fact, Hitler had a whole branch of his organization, of the Nazis, that were deeply involved in the study of esoteric religions of all kinds, and he brought together the symbolism and some of the ideals and ideas of those esoteric religions and tried to adopt them into Nazism. So just interesting. Sometimes you should, there's a great book, I think it might be out of print now, but there was a great book written a number of years ago that I got a copy of back when I was in college called Nazism and the Occult. And basically, it was an examination of how Nazism embraced many occult ideas and many Eastern ideas into its philosophy and its worldview. The founder of Buddhism, of course, you can't talk about Buddhism without talking about its history. The founder is Siddhartha Gautama, who later became known as, quote, the Buddha, even though we'll get into in a minute why that's not really an accurate title. And he lived during the 5th century BC, so 5 years before the time of Christ. Gautama was born into a wealthy family as a prince in present-day Nepal. And although he had a very easy life, he was deeply moved by suffering in the world. In fact, it was said that as a young man, when he was in his late teens and early 20s, that he used to go out into the city where they lived and into the surrounding towns and villages, and he was deeply disturbed by what he saw because he saw people living in grinding poverty, and he didn't understand the imbalance. He didn't understand why he lived in such in a lavish lifestyle while others had to endure such deep suffering. So he made a choice at the age of 21 to give up his lavish lifestyle and endure poverty. And so he embraced the Vedic concept, the Hindu concept of this extreme self-denial. But what he found over time was that did not bring him the kind of spiritual peace and fulfillment he was looking for. And that's what led him to develop the concept of the middle way, which means between the two extremes of self-denial and self-indulgence. He sought a life without social indulgence, but also without deprivation. So for this reason, you go to a Buddhist monastery, and unlike, say, in a Hindu monastery, where you might see extreme long periods of fasting and self-denial, in a Buddhist monastery, they live what they consider to be a very balanced life. Balance is a key core concept of Buddhism. In fact, if you've ever watched The Karate Kid, right? Mr. Miyagi taught you everything you need to know about Buddhism, right? When he told Daniel-san that the key is balance. The key is balance. Now, of course, to you as a Western viewer, you took it to mean, right, this kind of balance, right? Learning how to stay on your feet while you were being pushed and drawn by different forces. But it was deeper than that. It was a spiritual concept of maintaining balance, such as Buddhism, the middle way. After 6 years of searching, Buddhists believe that Gautama finally came to enlightenment while meditating under a Bodhi tree. And in fact, that very tree that they believe that he came to enlightenment beneath is still alive. Still alive. These trees live for many, many centuries. And so the place where this tree is still a place of pilgrimage to this day for Buddhist monks. They will go there and try to meditate beneath the tree, hoping that they'll catch a little bit of whatever it was that fell out of the tree and hit Buddha in the head. Anyway, he spent the rest of his life after that teaching others how to achieve this spiritual state of peace and freedom. Gautama passed away around 483 BC. Of course, he hadn't lived for very long. Obviously, you can tell from those dates. Of course, in those days, people didn't have the kind of longevity we have today. But almost immediately, his followers began to organize a religious movement around his teachings. His teachings became the foundation of what would eventually become Buddhism. In the 3rd century BC, this is 2 years after Gautama's birth, 2 centuries after Gautama's birth, Ashoka the Great, the Indian emperor, declared Buddhism to be the state religion of India. Buddhist monasteries were built with imperial funds, and missionary work was encouraged so that Buddhist missionaries began to travel and monks began to travel outside of India to spread the word of Buddhism. And over the next few centuries, Buddhism began to spread beyond India. The thoughts and philosophies of Buddhists became very diverse, with some followers interpreting their ideas very differently from others. So it's interesting because when you think of India, you often immediately think of Hinduism, right? But then when the king declared Buddhism to be the official state religion, of course, what that meant was that all other religions were frowned upon. So overnight, practically, the very, very ancient faith tradition of the Indian people was suddenly being challenged. And of course, Buddhism was very widespread in India at this time, but this actually led to physical violence. You know, we tend to think in terms of, Buddhists and Hindus as being peaceful, It's hard for us, namaste. It's hard for us to imagine, practitioners of religions that are kind of dedicated to pacifism and dedicated to nonviolence as getting violent with one another. But there was civil war that broke out several times during this period of time because of conflicts between the Buddhists and the Hindus during the time when Buddhism was considered to be the official state religion of the of the nation of India. But in the 6th century, this is 900 years later, the Huns invaded India. Now, this is Attila and his crew, who were a wrecking ball to the Eastern world. And when they did, they destroyed hundreds of Buddhist monasteries. And the intruders, even though they were eventually driven out of the country, the impact that they had was great. During that time, Hinduism rose up again and began to reestablish its dominance in areas of India. And so in the years following the repelling of Attila's invaders, they came to kind of an uneasy peace or a truce between the followers of Buddhism and the followers of Hinduism, even though, and they dropped the idea that it would be the state religion of India and began to allow people to practice other faiths. In the years immediately following, in the 10 years after the invasion of India by the Hun, Islam began to spread into India and very quickly grew to the point where Islam became the second largest religion, dominating Buddhism and kind of pushing Buddhism into the background of Indian culture. So today, that's very much the way things are there. In fact, in parts of India, Islam dominates completely. In fact, most of us are not, unfortunately, you're not students of history enough to understand that in those days, when Islam first came in and started to establish itself as a religious faith, there was no Pakistan. Pakistan did not exist, But what happened was that over time, as the Islamic numbers began to grow and grow and grow to the point where Islam was the second largest religion, they very shortly carved off a section of India and claimed it for themselves. Now, this is a pattern. When we get to the study of Islam, we'll talk about this. This is a pattern they have repeated over and over and over. They come into a culture as a minority group, right? Then they grow in number, and then they demand an independent republic. And that is how the Balkans came to be the Balkans. You'll hear our newscasters today talk about the Balkanization of a region, right? What they're talking about is dividing over that religious faith over the fact that Islam came in. So today in India, Islam is still the second largest religion behind Hinduism, but it is rapidly growing to the point where within the next 40 years, scholars predict that Islam will be the majority religion of India. It's already the majority religion of much of the Far East. You know, it's hard for us to imagine. You know, you kind of cast your mind back into past history, but in the early 1900s, Buddhism was still the primary religion of the chain of islands that we call the Indian Islands, Indonesia, and that whole area. Today, that is almost entirely Islamic. So that's how rapidly Islam has grown in the eastern part of the world. We're still used to thinking of Islam as being represented by Arabic peoples, but by far and away, Islam has experienced its greatest growth among Asian peoples. So lest you think, oh, I can spot a follower of Islam a mile off. No, not necessarily, okay? So we'll talk more about that when we get to the study of Islam. Today, there are many different forms of Buddhism. And the reason for that is precisely because Buddhism has no dogma, okay? They have no fixed set of doctrines. It's all about the path to inner spiritual peace and enlightenment, and whatever takes you to that place of inner spiritual peace and enlightenment works for you, okay? So therefore, Buddhism has been very open-ended to what I would call spiritual improvisation, okay? So for that reason, there are many different sects of Buddhism. I'm going to mention to you here the major sects of Buddhism. The first is what's called Theravada Buddhism, which is primarily prevalent in Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, and Burma. Remember now, that faith has been displaced now by Islam as being the majority faith in those countries. Then there is Mahayana Buddhism, prevalent in China and Japan, Taiwan. Tibetan Buddhism, prevalent in Tibet, Nepal, Mongolia, and Bhutan. And finally, Zen Buddhism, a branch of Mahayana Buddhism that's practiced in many of the same areas of the world, but it emphasizes spiritual simplicity and meditation. The word Zen, which we have adopted into Western culture, is taken in lieu of religious scripture, ceremony, or doctrine. And then finally, there is the most traditional form of Buddhism called Nirvana Buddhism. This term, nirvana, means the blowing out, meaning you reach a point where your consciousness of your state in life, whether it be good or bad, is kind of blown out like a candle, right? And you end all attachment to the things of this world and achieve a state of pure peace and enlightenment. Each one of these different types reveres certain texts and has slightly different interpretations of Buddhist teaching, which is why when we talk about Buddhism, it's hard to define, because a Buddhist will immediately ask you which kind, what type of Buddhism, okay? It depends on what part of the world you're in, and even, in fact, within certain countries, there might be different types practiced within. So think of that kind of in a way as like our denominations, but not exactly the same, okay? I think that's a more simplistic way of viewing it for us to kind of wrap our heads around, but that's not entirely accurate. Buddhist teachings, the original teachings of Gautama, which have been recorded, written down, are known as Dharma. He taught that wisdom, kindness, patience, generosity, and compassion were important virtues. Specifically, all Buddhists live by 5 moral precepts, okay, which are considered to be the 5 great truths. All of those truths are prohibitions of particular activities, okay? So they're all stated in the negative, right? First of the great moral precepts is no killing of living things. No killing of living things. So the true Buddhist, if you wanted to really get down to strict Buddhism, would be a vegetarian, okay? Because they can't kill anything living. No taking what has not been given, okay? Thou shalt not steal. No sexual misconduct. Now, how is sexual misconduct defined? Well, It depends on the branch of Buddhism, okay? Because there is broad interpretation among the various different practitioners of Buddhism as what constitutes sexual misconduct. But for certain, sexual misconduct is definitely defined as not taking another person's partner. In other words, what we would call do not commit adultery. No lying, you must always be a truth teller, and no use of drugs or alcohol. So, again, kind of contrary to sort of the Western-ish kind of adaptations of Buddhism. You come to the Western world where we have kind of experimented with Hinduism and Buddhist ways, and you have various different starlets and stars from Hollywood that are, kind of experimenting with Eastern mysticism, but you'll find that in many cases they also blend that with, partaking of their favorite substance that helps them achieve a state of enlightenment, right? In true Buddhism, that is completely frowned upon. No, okay? Then, in addition to the 5 moral practices, now this is funny because we'll get to that in just a second. Sorry, don't want to jump ahead of myself. In addition to the 5 moral principles, there's also 4 noble truths, okay? First is dukkha, which means the truth of suffering. Samudaya, which is the truth of the cause of suffering, what causes suffering. Nirodha, which is the truth of the end of suffering. Magga, with 2 G's, so it's not Make America Great Again, is the truth of the path that frees us from suffering. Those are the 4 noble truths. So unlike Hinduism here, who might see embracing of suffering as the way to go, the Buddhist wants us to the goal is to escape from suffering. Suffering is not a good thing in the Buddhist faith. So again, the truth of suffering, that's the reality of it. What causes suffering, the end of suffering, and the path that frees us from suffering. Those principles explain why human beings hurt and how to overcome suffering. Okay? Now, I want to pause for just a minute and kind of focus in on that, because again, we talk a lot about how Gautama sought the middle path between the extremes of self-deprivation and self-indulgence, right? So you would think kind of that almost kind of like a middle-class mentality, I don't want to be too rich, I don't want to be too poor. And that really was, in many ways, his way of thinking. That's the right way, the right path for all people. And yet, by the same token, he was honest enough to recognize that suffering comes our way regardless, okay? Regardless of the path we choose, we're still going to suffer. We're going to suffer a certain amount of deprivation in life. We're going to suffer setbacks. We may suffer devastating illness or sickness, whatever. But he came up with what he believed were principles or truths of conduct that would lead us to the place where we are no longer conscious of our suffering, okay? This is a real key to understanding Buddhist thought, because Buddha's goal was to reach a place where he was at such peace that even if he suffered, he would not be conscious of it. He would not be aware of it. In other words, he would not allow the suffering to consume him, to overtake him and become a part, a central part of his lifestyle. In other words, he would be devoted to his way of living that would lead him to a place where he was detached from, right? Detached from that sense of oppression or that sense of suffering or whatever it was that was coming against him. And that, to him, was the way of peace, because, again, suffering is unavoidable in this life. Suffering is going to come to everyone. Even the most privileged, even the most wealthy are going to suffer. So, therefore, the only way forward and the only way to true peace was to get to a point of detachment from suffering and reaching that state where you're at inner peace no matter what it is you may be going through externally. That is pretty much, I would say, that sums up the total sum goal of Buddhism. Finally, there's an 8-fold path. Remember, we talked about 5 moral principles, 4 noble truths. There's 8-fold path. This is the path to achieving this state of rightness, of inner rightness that will bring you to a place of spiritual peace. First, right understanding, meaning right thinking, right worldview. Right thoughts, meaning that you keep your thoughts in discipline and under control. That's different from right understanding. Okay? You don't just allow your mind to wander and take off on paths that you don't want it to go on. You discipline your brain. Right speech, meaning speaking things that are right. Right action means living right. Right livelihood means you choose a way of life, a way of earning a living that's consistent with inner peace for you, and that might be different for different people. Right effort or right work. Right mindfulness, keeping your mind sit on the goal of eternal peace. Right concentration, and that last one, right concentration, really is about meditation, okay? It's about learning how to focus the mind on the things that are designed to achieve and come to a place of peace and inner tranquility, okay? Now, here's what's interesting to me in all of this. Almost everything in Buddhism is ethical. It's about living the right way. And yet, as we have already defined, there is no dogma. There is no teaching, right? No ultimate foundational teaching that defines what that right way is, because that right way may be, and this is the reason why Buddhism has been interpreted so broadly and why there are so many branches and divisions, if you will, denominations of Buddhism, because there is no central dogma that you can appeal to and say, this is what we do, this is how you conduct yourself, outside of the 5 moral principles, okay? So the question then becomes, how do you define what is right action, right? How do you define what is the right path and what is the right way? And here is the answer that a Buddhist will give you. Everyone must discover that for themselves, right? There is no one right path. What might be the right path for you would not be the right path for me. Now, that sounds all cool, you know, and kind of hippie-ish on the surface of things, you know. You can easily see how that would be embraced by people back in the 60s and 70s who were into the bohemian lifestyle, right? But think about that. Think that through. No true moral dogma. Therefore, how do we discern what is right or wrong? Well, we just do it by kind of feeling our way along and determining what is right for us. And as I've stated in talking about Hinduism the other week, same kind of idea, same kind of concept. You eventually run up against this idea of how do you define what morality is if morality is considered open-ended enough that everyone kind of makes their own decision, right? Because then what do you do with a Jeffrey Dahmer? You know, his right path is eating folks. You know, is that considered to be moral? Well, no. The Buddhist would immediately fall back on their 5 principles: don't kill any other living thing. Okay, right? So again, you stay within the principles, and you're allowed to kind of choose your own path and your own way. But again, a very, very open-ended idea. And in all of this, you'll notice one thing is missing. One thing is missing: God. God. At least in Hinduism, even in the strictest of Vedic Hinduism, we have a goal, right? And the ultimate spiritual goal is reunification with God, with the Atman, with the Creator Spirit, right? That we eventually reach a point where we have reached enough spiritual or moral purity where we die, and this time we don't get recycled, we get reunited with the God from which we originally broke away or became part of this creation as a result of being separated from, right? Whereas in Buddhism, nothing about God whatsoever. This is all about your personal journey to what really Buddhism would consider to be success, okay? Success on the terms of Buddhism, right? Not success necessarily on the terms of Western culture, you know, with material things and riches and wealth and all that kind of stuff, but success as defined by Buddhism, which is primarily defined by inner peace, okay? Now, we as Christians, of course, would critique this because we would say there is no path to inner peace that does not include peace with God, right? There is ultimately no path to inner peace that does not include peace with God. The Buddhist would be completely content with finding inner peace completely divorced from any concept or idea of God, because the goal is the inner peace, right? That is the goal, to land in that place of inner peace where you're at harmony with yourself, at harmony with your world around you, and so on, at peace with your circumstances, whatever those circumstances might be. That is the ultimate goal. Whereas for us, we say, well, there's a God with whom we deal, and we're seeking peace with him. We're seeking to be reconciled to him, made right with him. Whereas the Buddhist sees life in terms of making yourself right with life itself, right? You know, no matter what life throws at you, right? To be a person who has achieved a place of rightness and peace within and harmony and so on, that is the ultimate goal of Buddhism, even if it means that God doesn't really enter the picture. Now, this is why I started off by saying that you can be a Buddhist and believe in God, and many do, okay? But ultimately, Buddhism itself as a practice is not about getting right with that God, even if you believe in God. Even if you're a Buddhist who is a theist, your ultimate goal is that sense of inner peace and how you arrive at that sense of inner peace. And it's by following this path laid out for us by the first, but certainly not the last Buddha. And that makes me want to circle back around to something I don't think I mentioned, right? Buddha is a title, but it's not a title reserved exclusively for Gautama, okay? Gautama is seen by many as the first Buddha, but any one of you who achieves his level of enlightenment and peace, you too can be a Buddha, okay? Because Buddha simply means an enlightened one. And anyone who pursues that enlightenment and inner peace truthfully from a true heart can become a Buddha, can become an enlightened one, okay? So that is Buddhism in its essence. A little bit difficult for us to really to define that, like I said, because it is so open-ended, okay? All right. We'll go ahead and shut down the live stream, and then I'll entertain any questions anybody might have.